All right. Hello, everyone. Today I have Khalil Sayegh. I think it's how you pronounce your last name. I should have asked you before we went live. I wanted to ask you today about your experiences as a Palestinian Christian and as well some of what's been going on recently in the news. There's been a renewed sort of focus on Palestinian Christians recently, but I often feel this discussion is like Americans having discussions about what goes on in Israel, Palestine, with very little talks with people who actually live there or have lived there. So last week, I had a few Israeli Christians on to discuss their experiences living in Israel proper. But I know in the Palestinian territories, there's a very, very different experience. So welcome, Khalil.
Thank you, Garan. Thanks for having me, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so you grew up in Gaza, I think especially during the Second Intifada. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your experiences growing up there.
So my first conscious memory of growing up in Gaza as to relate to the conflict or the Intifada was 2001 when the Israeli forces start bombing Gaza using Air Force. I remember I was at school terrified as a kid looking at what's happening, the bombing. It was my first time experiencing bombing. We've experienced the military checkpoints and other means of oppression that existed, but not really the bombing that we have seen. And then the second Intifada, I remember experiencing what my family have told me for so long, that the Israelis have uprooted our family from the village that they belonged to in 1948, that they were forced because of war to leave, and they were never allowed back, that their property was confiscated, etc. So all that was conceptual to me. And in the second Intifada, it became reality where you feel it. So there was this bombing that terrified the people in Gaza. People were being killed, etc. But on the other hand, there was also the other system of oppression, which really restrict the freedom of movement of Palestinians in Gaza, and that is the checkpoints that existed. That was before the Israelis' withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. Those of you who know, Israel withdrew in 2005 and issued a very strict siege after they left. And that was at a time when settlers were still living in Gaza. That is, Israeli civilians who live in the occupied territories of Gaza, and there were about 4,000 settlers living there. But imagine, Giron, the 4,000 settlers were controlling the freedom of movement of the 1 million Palestinians. Now we're 2 million, but we used to be 1 million, controlling the water resources, the land, etc. So it was a very suffocating situation during the Second Intifada.
Yeah, maybe we can go back there as well to your parents. You mentioned, I think it's your grandparents, right? We're living in what's now Ashkelon, I think you mentioned, and we're driven off. Because growing up, I heard a very different narrative than what I've now been reading about happened. Because growing up in a Jewish family, I remember we visited Israel when I think I was around 14 with a close family friend. And I remember the mother of this close friend telling me about how her father was a Holocaust survivor. And then he came back to Romania after the Holocaust, and there was nothing left for him there. So he came to Israel, got right off the boat in 48, and immediately took up weapons to go fight. Because in their mind, the invasions of the various Arab armies in 1948 was an extension of the Holocaust. And that's how I learned about it growing up, is that this was a war in which, had the Israelis not won, they would have all been, like, the Jews would have been wiped out there. So I'm curious if you can tell your narrative of how your family understood this.
Yeah, so the story, people misunderstand the story as if it started in 1948. And the story, if you take it as it started in 48, I think you missed the whole point. It started much before that. Since the Jewish immigration to the land of historical Palestine, there has been issues. And we saw, revolutions, and we saw uprising by the Palestinians rejecting Jewish immigration, and rejecting Jewish immigrations out of a very concise reasons. As Palestinian Christian have written in one of the papers, Carmel paper or Palestine paper, I'm not sure, one of them, my memory has forgotten. He said we would be willing to welcome the Jewish immigrants to Palestine, but with two conditions. The one, they have to learn Arabic, and the second condition, they have to forsake their foreign passport. So meaning the objection to the Jewish immigration to Palestine wasn't because it was immigration, but it was because it's colonization. The Palestinian intellectuals understood very well that the Zionist project is about to establish a Jewish state in their land and they're not only coming as immigrants, and that's why they refuse the Jewish immigration. Then the story of 1948 actually started in 1947. The Palestinians and the Jewish residents at that time, Jewish residents later become Israelis, have clashed over the declaration of the independence of Israel. Israel has started already in 1947 to push Palestinians out of their villages and out of their homes, etc. And this influx of refugees to the Arab lands, the neighboring Arab lands, have pushed the Arab armies to come. But even Israeli historians like Avi Shlaim would argue that even the Arab military who invaded Israel to fight against the new born state of Israel weren't really after destroying Israel. They were after taking each piece of land out of what's the property that should have belonged to Palestinians. So that's, I think, the narrative. But here's the thing, Gideon, even if all that story is true, that the Zionists are telling themselves that Palestinians just left by themselves, that the Arab military came to carry out a Holocaust, whatever. Let's assume all of that is true. What happened to my family after 1948 is that even families who remained in what's today known as Ashkelon, used to be known as Mashdal, were forced out to either Lod or to Gaza Strip. Even after the war is over, they were forced out. And not only that, they were never allowed back. So assuming that it is, the fog of war or because of war or whatever, the people are forced to be refugees. You'd expect after 2 years of stability, after the war is over, that you will allow people back. So no, they weren't allowed back. And as Ben Gurion has said very, very, very clearly stated that we cannot have a Jewish state without population transfer. And population transfer is just another word for ethnic cleansing in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that then sets the background. So your family were already refugees, right, being here then in Gaza, and then as well in 1967, then Israel takes over Gaza and is imposing all these restrictions, because you mentioned this restriction of movement for this very small settler population. How was it being a Christian in Palestine? Like, was being a Christian in Gaza a significant difference from had you been a Muslim there? Like, do you think it's more that this was a national struggle, or was there also a religious aspect to it?
I think it's a national struggle. But the fact that it's national struggle does not mean that there are religious actors who would understand it in religious terms, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you think of it, this is one of these conflicts where every almost sect and religion has its own interpretation. I mean, Christian Zionists would look at it as apocalyptic conflict that involved end days, etc. Muslims look at it, some of them. The Shiite would look at it as this part of also end days time of that relates to Mahdi, etc. Sunni Muslims see it as the promise of God for them to liberate Jerusalem. Again, Jewish people would look at it as the promised land, and God has promised it to them, and they have to be their settlers out of the Jews. Would say that it's related to the coming back of the Messiah. So each of the religious sects understand it in their own terms. Palestinian national movement itself, I think, is pretty much was a secular movement early on, especially the intellectual leaders were a lot of Christians who were taught and learned in France and London and other places. However, with the rise of the Islamic movements, Hamas and the others, right after the 90s, I do think that the conflict took the shape or the form of more an Islamic versus Jewish conflict, but it was never this way. The people themselves understand very well, the majority of them, that's not the case. But today it's growing more and more that perhaps almost the majority of Palestinians understand it in religious terms, and a lot of Israelis understand it in religious terms as well. As it portrayed to my own personal experience, as a Palestinian, I really never felt the difference between me and my Muslim brothers and sisters. We're under the same oppression, under the same occupation, we carry the same passports, etc. However, when Hamas took control of Gaza in 2006, I start feeling the difference between not being Muslim. Because when Hamas start Islamizing the society and Islamizing the public square, it start feeling uncomfortable for Christian or non-Christians, anyone who wasn't a Muslim or adhered to a very strict interpretation of Islam that Hamas follow, will feel forsaken or foreseen that they are outside of this, whatever public square religion they are trying to impose or achieve. And that made me feel forsaken. And then later on, actually, it turns out that Hamas, even themselves, when it comes to religion in the public square, even themselves had to moderate, because the Palestinian society was far more moderate than the Hamas ideology and what they wanted to achieve. So they themselves, they had to limit their own attempt to Islamize the society. And then, you start feeling that the difference. But by then I had already left Gaza.
Yeah. You grew up as well, right? Your mother is Catholic, your father is Orthodox. So you've experienced sort of both aspects of the Christian community there. And I also know there's an evangelical church, and you spent a little while with the evangelicals. So what is it like, the relationship among the various Christians in Gaza?
As the community starts shrinking and shrinking more, people are leaving more and more because of the siege, because of the war, and also because of Hamas and the Islamization. There became a bound between all the churches in Gaza, where you sometimes find the same person who goes to the Orthodox church would go to the Catholic church after and goes to the Baptist, because there was such thirst for Christian teaching and such thirst for community. People want to meet each other, see each other, etc. We were around 1,500 only in Gaza, and you can imagine the need to really communicate. The Catholics needed the Orthodox, and the Orthodox needed the Baptists, and etc. They married from each other, they intermarried. That's the only way possible to continue to have a continuity, because you can't marry a Muslim by law and also by faith as well. So all that has bounded the community all together. I remember I would go with my dad to the Orthodox church, but I also would go as a young kid to the Catholic church. But as I told you before, get on, I wasn't really a faithful Christian up until I left Gaza, actually. And it was there in Ramallah through evangelicals that I became a faithful Christian. And I was evangelical for a long time of my life. And now I'm in this space where I'm sort of going back to the tradition and reclaiming this heritage where I came from, where I found more rich into the theology and the tradition than I've ever had experience before.
Yeah. Something I've tried to highlight as well on this channel is the experience of converts throughout the Middle East, because there's sort of two interrelated issues, right? As you have the native Christians, and I found in a number of countries in the Middle East, the native Christians will have it perfectly fine from various Muslim governments. But I have a lot of friends who are converts from Islam who, when they go to local Catholic or Orthodox churches, are turned away by the local priests. Yeah. They won't baptize them. And yeah, if you could talk about that at all.
Absolutely. So this is more complicated issue and sensitive for everyone. I think that there is general consensus among traditional churches not to accept converts, because there is verbal understanding between the Islamic governments previously, since the Khilafah or the Khalifa, and the churches, that one of the conditions to allow the churches to worship freely is to not accept converts. Right now, we have secular governments and we have new laws. The church still sort of follow the old law and the old sort of verbal agreement, despite that by law, like by Palestinian law, there is no restriction over conversion. You could convert legally. I mean, obviously in Gaza, it's different. Under Hamas, you get tortured, imprisoned, etc. But in Palestine, officially in the West Bank, there is a freedom of religion. It's complicated within the law, because the First Amendment says that Islamic law is where you get your legal basis, but it's a very vague terminology, and thus there is freedom. And I know converts themselves that have experienced horrific stuff, and converts who had it more comfortable. So the evangelicals would be the ones to accept them more. Evangelicals are not bounded by this tradition of the verbal agreements, and they're after they're named evangelicals, right? So they are after evangelism. So there we would experience more conversion there. But at the Orthodox Church in Egypt, you'll see more converts who would come to Christianity there. But definitely, it's a more difficult situation for converts than for us. Overall, I think that the Palestinian Christian experience. I mean, the majority are obviously the natives who have been there since, the apostles, and their families has been there generations and generations. But we obviously, I mean, I've been always advocate for accepting our converts, brothers and sisters, because I think that's the church teaching is very clear, and the Bible is very clear in that you shouldn't turn off anyone who wants to adopt that faith, even if this will bring about persecution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've found sometimes there's some resentment of converts will have against the native Christians because the native Christians will be treated fine.
Yeah.
There's a tension there that needs to be worked through. And one of the big reasons I wanted to bring you on is I've found a lot of tension between the Jewish Christian communities. There's this large number of Jews who are believing in Jesus now, only a few coming into the traditional churches, most going through things like Messianic Judaism and so on. But I've found even among Jewish Catholics, sometimes they wanting to downplay the experiences of Palestinian Christians out of a concern that they're sort of being ignored. And I saw you were on LifeSite News, and one of the things you mentioned there is how no one had really covered your story. And I think from the Jewish Christian perspective, I'm in a number of Facebook groups and Twitter groups and so on of us, that they'll hear constantly is they'll say, oh, all the media ever talks about is the Palestinian Christians, and they ignore all these converts here. So it's very good to hear, I think, the importance of bringing our communities together and standing in solidarity as Christians, regardless of country and regardless of cradle or convert.
Yeah, we all come from different ethnic and religious backgrounds, and once you're in Christ, right? Like there is no Jew and Greek, and that's, I think, an emphasis that we have to emphasize on. But I think that especially with regard to our Jewish Catholic or Jewish Christians, brothers and sisters, I do feel, and that has been my reading. I have friends who are Jewish converts. I respect them. I love them. I always check on them. There is a sense that the last string attaching them to their Judaism is their Zionism. And if they forsake their Zionism, they're sort of not Jewish anymore completely, because they're already, casted out, right? Like the one thing that will make you un-Jewish for your average Jewish person is if you believe in Jesus, right? And thus, this, line of Zionism that they keep until the last moment. So they're very careful not to critique it or to allow it. And the Palestinian experience at its very core, it's challenging to the Zionist narrative. I'm not saying that you have to forsake your Zionism completely to accept the Palestinian narrative, but at least it would shake the Zionist narrative to its core. Because as you said, you learned in the Zionist narrative that it was great what happened in 1948. You had to go back, you had to really fulfill your statehood, etc. For the Palestinians, that was a tragedy. And guess what, Geran? For the Catholics, that was a tragedy. For the Orthodox, even for the Presbyterians, because churches were emptied in 1948. Some villages, the village of Beraim, up in the north of what's today the state of Israel, was bombed and destroyed completely by the Israeli military, despite that there were no resistance whatsoever. It's a Catholic village, it's a Maronite village, which belongs to Rome, was destroyed completely, and the residents are still alive until today, and their grandchildren, and they became citizens of Israel. They're even within the state of Israel, but they're not allowed to rebuild their church, and they're not allowed to go back to their villages. So that narrative, of Palestinian Christianity and the damage that was done to Palestinian Christianity by the Zionist project, I think one that challenged Zionism to its core, especially if you're a committed Christian. And I think that's why a lot of our brothers and sisters are very hesitant to engage with us on these matters.
Yeah, and you actually have done a bunch of engagement. That's one of the big reasons I reached out to you. So we'll get to that when we get to that part of your story. But I want to get back to your story a little bit. So you mentioned you eventually move from Gaza to the West Bank. And what caused that move?
In 2009, I've experienced the first war, full-scale war. I was in my school, and I've witnessed with my own eyes the bombing of graduation of police academy right next to my school. I was only 14 at the time. I saw 200 people being killed in front of my eyes. I went out of my school. I remember seeing the body, the blood, the parts of the bodies on there. It was very traumatizing, very shaking to me. and we spent about 4 weeks under attack by the Israeli military. It was really a horrific experience. The siege was being tightened in Gaza. We will get 6 hours of electricity out of 20 hours of 24 hours of electricity. The food became expensive. I could look at people, despite that I was 14, graduating from their colleges and not finding jobs. And in my mind, I've said there is no way I could stay here. Like, this would be my future. And I could see how Hamas are stubborn and the Israeli are stubborn, and they're going to keep fighting together for a long time. I mean, my dad thought it would take a couple of years, 3 years. I thought it would take 10 years or more. And unfortunately, I was verdicted on that. And in addition to that, I did not like Hamas as a authoritarian regime. I mean, they were imposing all sort of authoritarian measures in Gaza that are restricted to freedom, but also they were illiberal, and they were trying to impose illiberalism on the public square generally, not only with regard to religion, but with regard to morality, with regard how you look, etc. And I did not like that part. All of these things pushed me to move to the West Bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One other question I've always had, and I've never been able to find a clear explanation of, is that there's this vote for Hamas in 2006. The international community comes in and brings a vote and so on. And then I've heard there was never another vote after that. But why was that? Like, why did the international community impose an initial vote, but not impose a whole constitution that came with that?
So what's interesting is that they imposed 2 elections, and people usually focus on only the first election. The first election happened in 2005. That's a presidential election, because Palestine is a presidential system. That's according to the constitution. Who won? Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, won. President Abbas became the legitimate president. His term is 4 years and should have served between 2005 to 2009. He is the president. Then when Hamas won the election, not by majority, by the way, they won by the restriction, but they did not win the majority of votes. The majority of votes were distributed between Fatah and other parties, etc. But they won around 48%, which is huge number, by the way. And a lot of people who voted for them are not even Hamas. They just voted out of how sick they were of Fatah and the BA and corruption, etc. So this happened, and President Abbas was also the legitimate president. So Hamas had to divide power. You know, when you win a presidential election and they win a parliament, you have to have 2 separate powers: the president power and then the parliament power. Hamas wanted everything, basically. Now the critiques usually, and Western leftist scholar would write that Abbas didn't want, and that Hamas wanted to share power, but Abbas did not want. I saw no evidence for that whatsoever, except on Qatari funded channels of Al Jazeera and others. I was there. I lived through it. The president was. I mean, funny enough, our neighbor, literally 2 houses from where I lived, I was quite involved. Although I was a kid, my dad was involved. I read the books. I read the materials. And it is Hamas who rejected that. And in addition to rejecting that, Hamas wanted a total monopoly over weapons in Gaza. I am not aware of any system in the world where if you win a parliamentary election, you get to have monopoly over weapons. I'm not aware of the Republicans right now saying, well, I have to have a Republican military in the US because I won an election. So this happened. The BA obviously said no. They clashed, and Hamas controlled Gaza, because also partly the BA did not fight back. Hamas controlled Gaza fully. And since then, there was no elections for 2 reasons. The first reason, the division between Gaza and the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority said we cannot have election when Gaza is not under a legitimate authority. And Hamas didn't want election in Gaza. And the second, because East Jerusalem is not part of the Israelis are not allowing election in East Jerusalem, the Palestinians want election in East Jerusalem. And obviously, the international community is not pushing for it because they understand that there is a high probability Hamas would win. Now, if you look at the statistics and you understand how electoral politics work in Palestine, there are certain months and certain years where Hamas would win election if it happened, and there are certain times where Hamas would lose. And that's the trick. Right now, if you hold an election only in Gaza, not in the West Bank, just Gaza, I think Hamas would lose 100%. There is no way they will win. If you count the West Bank too, there is a chance Hamas would win. Not very high, by the way. They're not like, oh, the most popular or whatever. No, there is a chance they would win. So that's, I think, where the situation is right now. International community is not pressuring for that. and we remain stuck with these two political systems.
Yeah. So you moved then from Gaza to the West Bank to Ramallah, and it seems like the rest of your family stayed back in Gaza.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
They stayed in Gaza.
Mm-hmm. And yes, for those who don't know us, I should mention that your father and your sister have passed away during this war, and we'll get to that when we get to that later part of the story. And how old were you when you moved to Ramallah?
I was only 15.
Okay, so you move on your own then at 15.
I moved on my own, correct?
Yeah. And when you're in Ramallah then, right, you mentioned that you sort of rediscovered your faith. And if you could talk maybe a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah. So I wasn't like any time religious at all, or like didn't really think of religion as much. And part of it is it is, you know, watching movements like Hamas and other religious movements in front of my eyes ruining our lives, right? And imposing things, etc. So religion to me was not a thing. And I remember, you know, these two evangelicals who came out to me and start, you know, preaching Jesus to me and challenged me to read the gospel with them one time. And when I read the Gospel of John, Gideon, there was something striking about it that really captured my imagination, my heart, my thinking. I just looked at the personality of Christ, and you couldn't doubt that he is the Christ, the Son of God. You just couldn't doubt, even without thinking anything, and you couldn't doubt that he is the standard of morality, etc. And this transformed my heart, transformed my life, such as that I really want to follow this person, whoever he is. And for, as I said, for so long, that was through the evangelical church. I was evangelical fully until after I graduated from evangelical Bible college, etc. I think as I start thinking more of many questions about, you know, the tradition, the history, etc., I find myself more and more being drawn until now to tradition more and the apostolic churches.
Yeah. And were these missionaries who came up to you, did they know you were like nominally a Christian, or were they just going up to any random people in the West Bank?
I think they knew, yeah, they knew I'm nominally Christians. They were Palestinians too. They weren't like foreigners or anything. They were just evangelicals, Palestinians who were converted themselves as well.
Yeah. And then once you were in the evangelical church, I think you spent a little while studying theology there, I think at Bethlehem Bible College, if you want to talk about that as well.
For sure, yeah. So as I said, I went for theology school. I was, you know, trained. Also, I had a pastoral internship at the Baptist Church here in the U.S. I was ready to be a pastor in that space. But that around that time, after I graduated, etc., I think I start finding more and more discontent within, you know, what have become the evangelical church generally. I became more critical of the way of worship, than lack of centrality of Christ, you know, the too much charismatic center and pastor center, etc. And I think that led me to take more positions. And until now, I didn't take a decision to, like, you know, publicly revoke my connection to the Protestant faith or anything. But I go to Orthodox Church, which is where I feel the most comfortable and where my family came and where I was baptized and where I feel mostly at home. And you know, the divine liturgy of having, you know, Christ and also all the Bible from the Genesis to the Revelation presented at every divine liturgy and every move that you do at the church every Sunday. I think something that captures how I feel and how I think of theology itself, because that's the essence of all theology, right? That Christ is the center, and all these things from Genesis all the way to Revelation are fulfilled in this one person of Jesus Christ. And I like this about this our Orthodox approach that I'm practicing.
Yeah. How is that similar or different to, say, the approach you were learning among the evangelicals? Especially, I heard in another interview you mentioned how there's this very difficult relationship between Palestinian Christians and the Old Testament. And so, like, you could talk about that.
So I think that with regard to evangelicals, the difference is that the pastor can choose to talk about one specific subject once a week, and that's what you would be thinking about all the time. It's about the sermon and then the worship before, not necessarily Christ-centered. You don't really get from A to Z, and it works for a lot of people. I'm not saying it just works to me, I explain like I think the evangelical. I respect the evangelical faith. I respect the evangelicals. Uh, uh, I feel like it's more like a baby formula that you take when you're a baby, and it's great and it works for you very well. And then once you get mature, you need to have actual food. And I feel like the divine liturgy provide that food,
Mhm.
that food of the gospel center. That being said, there are evangelical churches that are more Christ centered, especially the more Presbyterian and Reformed than others. There is, I mean, like Timothy Keller has contributed a lot of writing on preaching the centrality of Christ, having Christ in the center, etc. But to me, like, why even go there when there
Mhm.
is something, the tradition that has been there for thousands of years, providing you exactly how to have always a Christ-centered approach? To me, that's just like uh, very very clear and obvious. With regard to the Old Testament, there are two schools of how Palestinian theologians treat the Old Testament. One, that is the more liberal school of that represented by Naim Atiq and other what's so called liberation theology, Palestinian liberation theology, that reject completely the idea that uh, the Old Testament is even inspired by God and understand it as, oh, this is just the understanding of how Jews understood the commands of God, and that's rejected by majority of Palestinian Christians. It's a very, small minority among intellectuals and theologians that don't represent the public at all. And then there is, other theologians who are take the inspiration of the Old Testament very seriously, and they see it as the Word of God, and they don't say that it was misunderstood or whatever, but they would say the interpretation and the hermeneutics and the exegesis of it is wrong when it comes to Christian Zionism and all these things. They would say that everything that is in the Old Testament was fulfilled in Christ. And they will understand it from the perspective of ethics too. That is it? They ask the question of, is it ethical for people to come and take another land and claim that the Bible tells them so, based on the book of Joshua, for example, etc. And they would say no. That being said, despite all these theological inquiries into the Old Testament, I'll tell you, Gideon, it's still hard for a lot of Palestinian Christians to read it. A lot of people skip it. I know that. I've told them, and I told them, no, you shouldn't. I mean, it's one of my favorite books. I mean, when I read the Psalms all the time to feel more, in connection with God and to worship, I read Exodus to feel more the passion of what God is doing in this world. So I think it's a big mistake to skip it, but it's hard, especially during this ongoing genocide in Gaza, where we've seen Mr. Netanyahu and others literally cutting the Bible to try to justify the mass slaughter. When he's cutting Amalek and he's talking about, to wipe the memory of Amalek and to wipe the memory of Amalek, every Christian Palestinian hears that and they know that this is part of their Bible, that this is part of our sacred text, and it is painful for us to see our sacred text used to slaughter us, to wipe us, to cause all these, inflict all this pain on us.
Yeah. It's something I've sort of discovered a lot in speaking with. I grew up in sort of, like you did, nominally religious family. And so going back now and engaging with more religious Jews, I found sometimes we have the same text of the Old Testament there, but it feels like we're reading different books because we are focused on all these stories and we see in every story, right, Christ prefigured there. And they're not focused on all. They're focused on how do you follow all these laws in specific? And then, as you mentioned here, right, there's a certain strand of Judaism that's now drawing on these conquest narratives and saying they need to be applied again. I was listening to this one rabbi who has a lot of great talks about religion online. So I sort of dove into his channel, and then I find him talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and he's bringing up the verse in Genesis about Ishmael to drive out the son of the bondswoman because he wouldn't hear it. And so seeing that then, and that's not to say, of course, that all Jews, there's also Jews who are a wide range of views on Zionism and so on. But there definitely is a strain here that's very problematic, as you mentioned, that's using it to justify atrocities, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's awful.
Yeah. And then to bring things back as well to, is you're now re-encountering the Orthodox faith now here in America. And so how do you think you could bring that a spirit like that back to the churches like that you grew up in? Like, do you think the church you grew up in, it's just that you weren't engaged with it, but everything was really there? Or do you think there needs to be like a re-engagement of Christian youth within like the Orthodox and Catholic churches in Palestine?
I think it's both. I think partly like the blame is on me. I'm not gonna blame it on the church. I think I wasn't faithful. I wasn't very interested. I was very rebellious, right? And I looked around me and I saw religion as bad generally. There was great people who are at the church, like my age, who were faithful. I wasn't myself, and they're awesome. But also, I think that the church has to spend more time, for, especially for young kids. Like younger kids wouldn't understand the liturgy in the same way we do, right? They need interpretation and they need explanation to what the faith is, etc. So no, I think there need to be more investment in teaching young kids what and teenagers, etc., what the faith entitled, why we do what we do, why we repeat what we repeat at the liturgy, and I think that would make a great way for them.
Yeah. Something else I want to ask you about is this issue of the Old Testament among Palestinian Christians. Something I've heard from a lot of American Catholics discussing this is they'll talk about how there might be, and I've seen various claims on genetics, I don't know, that actually the Palestinians are more ethnically closely related to the ancient Israelites. And I hear where they're coming from on that, but coming from a Jewish background, I look at Palestinian nationalist imagery, and it doesn't seem like even Palestinian Christians are portraying themselves in their national imagination as the people of the Old Testament. Like I put up on the for the thumbnail of this video, it included an icon I saw online, a Palestinian Christian head shirt of all the saints of Palestine. And it was notable to me. I can't read Arabic, so I couldn't look on everything, but it seemed to me like it was starting with the apostles and then going through lots of great saints who had lived in Palestine over the last 2,000 years. Versus if you had asked, say, like a Jewish Christian to draw an icon of the saints there, they would have focused a lot on the Old Testament saints, and then seeing the apostles as the culmination of this. And for looking at it from a Jewish perspective, it's all right, maybe you guys have some genetic connection, but it doesn't seem like a national identity connection, versus the Jews have been praying, right, for 2,000 years to return to this land. I'm not trying to justify things. I'm just trying to put sort of where I'm trying to come at and understand the Palestinian national identities. I think you're very right. There is a national identity there, but I'm trying to better understand what that national identity is.
For sure, the national identity does not really address the Old Testament thing or how they were part of the Israel, etc. That's just a genetic question that was published by Hebrew, by the way. It's a Jewish scholar who came out with this facts. He did run the numbers and the genetic test, and he found that the most, close people to the ancient Israelites are the Samaritans, and then the Palestinian Christians, and then the Muslims, and then Sephardic Jews, and then Ashkenazi, etc. So it's not like a study we refer to, or it's not even of a concern to the Palestinians generally, or to the Palestinian Christians, because we're really focused on the fact that we are in Christ, and whether my ancestors were Israelites or whether they were Gentiles, it does not matter. I think where it comes to play here, when it's invoked by the other side, that is the Israelis, to justify the confiscation of land, the confiscation of our own property, the crimes, the genocide, etc. That's, I think, where it becomes offensive. So, and you come with two approaches to that. Palestinians, when they're pushed with these things, the traditional sort of leftist, Marxist Palestinians have denied the Old Testament scholarship completely, meaning they said that the Old Testament does not contain any history, and therefore this whole entire story of Israel, David, etc., is not in a historical Palestine whatsoever. And some Christians have subscribed to that, who are technically, I don't know what's their Christian faith, but they subscribe to that based on these Marxist theories, etc. The other group would say, no, this is just a real story, etc., but it's my story. I was here, my ancestors were here, etc. So this is more of a response to the Israeli narrative, and what's happening then. It's part of our story. Our story is very simple, Gadon. We were there for centuries. Nation state weren't a thing. I personally would argue even that the kingdom of Israel wasn't really a nation in the sense of understanding nation today. You know, it was developed later, etc. And thus, to try to think of it in these terms is not precise. And the Palestinian nation wasn't a thing 2,000 years ago either. You know, we lived there. We were different tribes, different people, and we lived there. We became a nation during the era of nation states, during the era when every other nation state was becoming a nation, and we became a nation. And I think that that's our narrative, and the unfortunate reality that as a nation we're never allowed to live with the freedom and liberty that we deserve as a nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for all of that. I think you're right, because it's national identity is something that's developed very recently. And I think in one of the early critiques a lot of religious Jews had of Zionism is that it was imposing that same national identity sense on Jews, that there was a sense of Jews as a people always, but it reconfigures it in terms of a nation state. And I think that's an important point you bring up there. So while you were living in the West Bank as well, you mentioned we don't probably want to name names of people, but you were working for a while for a sort of pro-Israel Christian organization. And I'm very curious to sort of hear your story of how did you get involved with them? What was it like working for them? I've heard a lot of interviews you did with them and stuff, and then eventually your break with them and your decision to leave.
Yeah. So to start with, the group wasn't considered themselves pro-Israel in public. They call themselves a Christian positive engagement with the Middle East. The way they approach it is that they have pro-Israel folks, they have not pro-Israel folks. It's focused on Christianity, etc. At that time, my passion and big part of what I was doing, and still I'm doing today, is to explain how Hamas is terrible for the Palestinians. And I still do this. I'm still very committed to it. They like that. They approached me and asked me if I would work for them. At the beginning, I said no. 2 years in, I said yes. I worked for them as a contractor. And then with time, I start realizing that they're not really about Christianity or Christian advocacy, and sadly, they're just extremely one-sided. And really, it's sad in my heart because there are some faithful Christians that work for this organization, but ultimately, the organization itself does not serve the purpose of Christ or Christianity. It just serves the purpose of the most, extreme warmongers figures in this country. The billionaire who's behind this organization is really a warmonger, one that really would like to see more and more war in the Middle East, would like to see Christianity and people like myself really disappear from Palestine, because to them it's an obstacle. It's an obstacle of this state they want to see, because the Christians are harder to demonize than our Muslims brothers and sisters, despite that we as Christians see, and myself, I see responsibility to also defend my Muslim brothers and sisters and their humanity and dignity, because that's a very dangerous trope that Christians fall to humanize Palestinian Christians, but dehumanize our Muslims brothers and sisters. So that's my story with them. Then, when I came to the US after I finished my grad school, I also worked with them for 9 months, and that was enough for me to respectfully break roads. I don't attack them. They say stuff about me, but I don't attack them. I don't respond. They don't say it in public, obviously. I respect some of the people who work there. I just don't respect what they do, because it's not based on facts. It's based on deception, and that's it.
Yeah. One of the events I saw you at there was a question of sort of a development some people wanted to have of Catholic Zionism, and there was a whole conference about that, and I saw you at that there, and I'd just be curious to hear sort of I don't know how much you want to talk about things, because things
Sure.
probably happen there, but sort of your experiences with that, and then we can go on to other stuff after that. But
sure, yeah. So my response would still be the same. I don't know what Zionism means today, when there are ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, when there are no rights, etc. Are we as Christians are called to be thinking of Zionism right now, instead of be thinking of defending the most vulnerable people who are oppressed under the name of Zionism? So I think Christian Zionism or Catholic Zionism, whatever, I am careful how to say it, but it makes mockery of the faith. I'm not going to go as far as to say it's a heresy. Almost it's close to there, but because it literally insult the dignity of humans under the name of Christianity. Now, if you are a Zionist and a Christian, that's a different game, right? I'm anti-Zionist. I'm still anti-Zionist, but I would accept the premise you're coming with. But if you say I'm a Christian Zionist, then you lost me completely, because I don't see my faith to be used to justify Zionism. That's, I think, the difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things, I can't remember if you mentioned it there and other things, but you have talked about recognizing the issue of anti-Semitism as well, and you've spoken about that.
Yeah.
That actually was one of the things I really liked about you when I was discovering you, because it seems to me, and I don't know how much you've seen it, that there does seem to be a certain group of people who are using the very genuine suffering of Palestinian Christians to promote an ulterior motive, which is really a hatred of Jews. And especially among sort of in left-wing circles, you can talk about Palestinian Muslims, but in right-wing circles, it's very easy to latch onto. I often hear, I saw a comment yesterday on Twitter where it had the picture of the church being hit in Gaza recently, and it had the people who crucified Christ 2,000 years ago are crucifying him again.
That's awful. Yeah.
And if you could talk maybe about how, do you think this is a very marginal thing in the movement, or do you see this as a significant issue that has to be dealt with?
I think it is both marginal and significant. There is no contradiction. Marginal in terms of number and significant in terms of influence. Anti-Semitism is very real. It's a dangerous poison that can poison any space that it enters to. Now, on the pro-Palestine, the left wing, it's much more complicated there, and I'm not going to discuss it for the intent of our conversation about the Christians. I have a sense, as a non-Christian, I'm a Christian, as a non-Western Christian, I'm not a Western, that the Western Church generally tend to either idolize the Jews or dehumanize the Jews. There is no middle ground here. So the Jews, either they're the chosen people, they deserve everything, they can kill the Palestinians, etc., or they're the demons, they're the killer of Christ, etc. And I'm afraid that both of these are dehumanizing to the Jews, and I'm afraid that both of these views can lead to more and more anti-Semitism. So the question, or the solution, is how do you normalize the Jews? The Jews are human beings, like us, equal to us. They are in dignity, they're created in the image of God, etc. And thus, anti-Semitism is dangerous, it's despicable, and we have to reject it completely. Now, what is anti-Semitism is the question. It's the irrational hatred of Jews based on these historical and non-historical tropes that are lies, such as the killers of Christ, such as, they're the ones who control the government, the ones that launder the money, the ones that control the banking, etc. All these things, right? These are anti-Semitism. But to say that the state of Israel today is committing a genocide, for example, to say that this is a blood label or anti-Semitism, this is ridiculous. You could argue it's not committing genocide, and let's argue about the facts, but don't accuse me that this is blood label when Israel is starving children today in Gaza and killing people. Let's argue that it's not the truth. But don't argue it's a blood label, because it's not. We're talking about Israel. We're not talking about the Jewish people. If I say the Jewish people are committing a genocide, well, maybe you could argue that. But I'm not saying even the Jewish people. I'm saying the state of Israel, the same state that has ethnic cleansed the Palestinians in 1948, same state that is annexing the West Bank today. And today they passed a law in Knesset to annex the West Bank, thus declaring Israel as an apartheid state. This same state, you cannot conflict it, and that's the dangerous, because they're trying to push this IHR, not IHR, what's called the International Holocaust. There's this definition of anti-Semitism trying to push. I forgot the name. IH something, where it explained basically that to criticize Israel or anything that happened with Israel historically is sort of anti-Semitic, and I reject that completely.
Yeah, and I think there's actually a danger on the other side as well of, I've seen people point out and say, all right, but 90%, whatever it is, of Jews support Israel. But I've also seen in a lot of circles, because of the anti-Semitism that's sometimes in these pro-Palestine groups, that it then drives them into the other side. I have a friend of mine who's a rabbi who is very critical of Zionism. And he told me he spent a number of years in Jerusalem and yeshiva there. And he was walking home from yeshiva one night and he sees some Jews, they're picking up rocks, and he asks them what they're doing, and he says, I'm going to go throw them at Arabs to get them to leave here. And he called them Nazis to his fellow Jews there. So he's very clearly very critical of Zionism, but he was just walking around a college campus and started being harassed because he was dressed like a Jew. But at the same time, I also think some Jews will focus so much on this that they then miss the other story, which is yet sucks sometimes to be harassed a little bit. It's a lot worse to have your entire civilization be destroyed.
Absolutely.
Which is, I think, what your people have experienced.
Exactly. And by no means we minimize, again, these experiences, that there's no such a thing as comparative suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I hate comparative suffering. And yes, we're going through genocide. Yes, we're going through this horrific things that we're going, but I would not tolerate anti-Semitism or anyone that is anti-Semitic. I have just zero tolerance for that.
Mm-hmm. You know, I've really appreciated that. It's made me feel that you're much more consistent and a very clear moral voice in all of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Gala.
Yeah. Another video I saw you in as well was, this is actually the video that caused me to reach out to you. It was a video that was uploaded recently. I don't know how long ago it was filmed, because it was still mentioning Pope Francis. Where it was you, Gavin DaCosta, and Phaedra Shapiro. And you had gone to an event, it sounded like, with Phaedra Shapiro to discuss sort of Palestinians and Jews talking alongside one another. I'd be curious if you could talk maybe about your engagement with Christian Zionists, but as well your engagement with Jewish Zionists and having spoken with them and so on.
Yeah, so no, that was an event where Jews and Christians get to talk about, the what is common and uncommon between our faiths, and how do we relate to the land and to the Holy Land. And I think it was a very constructive conversation. And it's always, it's impossible to disconnect spirituality, religion, in our case, from also the politics. So Phaedra is a dear friend of mine. She's an Orthodox Jew. She's a scholar of Christian-Jewish relationship. I like her. I respect her dearly. But when it comes to Zionism, for example, we disagree, and we disagree deeply on this question. Despite that she's not, pro-war or anything, she's pro-peace. But still, we disagree on fundamental issues, and that was a great event we were at.
Yeah. Maybe we can get now into the what's been going on recently. First of all, in Gaza, you've lost 2 family members in this war, so maybe you could talk a little bit about what's been going on there.
Sure, yeah. So, as many people who've lost a lot of relatives and a lot of people, I lost my sister and my father due to both, actually, due to Israel and the Israeli military intentional prevention of medical care that caused their death in both cases. We've lost also a lot of relatives in the bombing of the Catholic Church, the recent one just last week. The woman from Ayad who was killed is related to me. She's one of my relatives. I've lost people also at the bombing of St. Bartholomew's Church in 19th of October 2023. So things are bad. And right now we are seeing more and more starvation of the Palestinians happening in Gaza. Israel has wiped off entire towns from the Gaza Strip. They destroyed it. It's disseminated. I don't know how we're going to rebuild it. All hospitals, schools, etc. are destroyed in the Gaza Strip. That is going on in Gaza. It's happening all the time. In the West Bank too. The way the Israeli system and the Israeli settlements are being constructed, such as to make Palestinian state impossible, such as not only to make Palestinian state impossible, to make the life as a Palestinian in the West Bank impossible, to suffocate you, to not allow you to move, to not allow you to move from a place to another, etc. And today in Knesset, as I said, they voted to annex the West Bank, which means the Palestinians technically live under a full sovereignty of Israel, but with zero rights and with zero representation. But in the midst of all of that regime, violence and oppression against the Palestinians, come sub-violence of that, which is the terrorism of the settlers. That is talked about usually as settler violence, meaning that there are random Jews who live in the West Bank, go and attack Palestinians. And many times they attack Palestinian Christians, as we saw in the town of Taiba. But I don't call it settler violence, Gerard. I call it settler terrorism because it is politically motivated. These people have a theory of change and a clear one, which is they don't want to see Palestinians there, Christians or Muslims. They want to see only Jews, and they say it that the land of Israel is only for Jews, and thus we don't want to see anyone else. And that's why they attack churches. That's why they attack mosques. That's why they attack homes, etc. And this group of people are armed by the country. They're not armed by smugglers or something. They're armed by the state of Israel. And who pays for that? You as taxpayer pays for that. And we've seen just a few weeks ago how many times they attacked Taiba, the only Christian village. That Taiba is the only remaining Christian village, which means no one lives there except Christians, and yet still they're being attacked, knowingly that they're Christians, and knowingly that this is our churches that they've attacked, and yet they attacked it.
Yeah, I want to get back to Taipei in a minute because I want to do a deep dive because this has been in the news a lot recently. Before that, as you mentioned, there's this settler terrorism, and something I found, I've listened now to like probably like 10 or 12 interviews with you, and every time I hear like a new horrible thing that's happened to you or someone you know that you didn't mention in any other interviews, because there's just so much that you've been through in this. And I remember we sort of skipped over, I should ask about this when we were discussing your life in the West Bank, as you mentioned that you were the victim both of settler terrorism as well as of the police there. So if you could talk about your experiences with that.
I can tell you numerous times, Geron, of times, only because I'm Palestinian, I am stopped by Israeli soldiers and being beaten up for no reason. And that's the daily experience of the Palestinians in the West Bank. Last time I was there in 23, in actually January 2023, I was almost killed by Israeli settlers who thrown literally big rocks on my car as I was driving from Bethlehem to Nablus in the West Bank. Literally big rocks that were thrown on my car, and the Israeli military was watching them as they were throwing big rocks on my car. My cousin was beaten up by Israeli settlers as he went on a hike with his friends. So it's a constant thing that happens, and I personally have experienced it, yes.
Yeah, and I also think there's a dishonesty, I feel like, oftentimes when these settlers come and talk to the West. So I was watching quite a number of videos online by the settler in Hebron named Yishai Fleischer, who has a big online outreach, right? And when he's online, he was talking about, he's like, no, we want peace with the Palestinians. Like, I'll grant the residency status and so on. But then I found a video of him where he was talking only to a Jewish audience. I don't know if you know it was recorded or something, where he was talking about how he wants to get rid of all mosques and churches from Israel. And just seeing that, like, okay, that's what you actually think. But then you come to the West and you make videos with evangelical pastors about why Israel should be annexing the West Bank.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's you articulated very well. That's who they are. That's their views. And this particular person has literally, where he lives, they have the tomb of Goldenstein, who killed people in 1994 when he entered mosque and killed them. And they visit that place because to him, he's like a saint. He's like someone important. And he literally, a terrorist who went in to a mosque and killed tens of Palestinian innocents.
Yeah. And yeah, maybe people don't know about that story. If you could talk about that story a bit.
In the 90s, there is this one American Jewish doctor who became Israeli citizen, walked to the mosque of the Abrahamic Mosque in Hebron and opened fire on people as they were praying on Friday and killed a lot of them. And he was killed by the people who were praying, who beat him up with their own bare hands, and he was killed on the spot.
Yeah, and it's pretty shocking. Sometimes I see some people saying crazy stuff like fellow Christians on Twitter, and I get really shocked. And I think, is there a real serious issue that like we have? But I debate a lot of Jews on Twitter about theology. And there's one guy I've been debating a bunch back and forth, and I see him post a tweet in Hebrew, so I just just translate on it, and it was Baruch Goldstein was right.
Wow.
And seeing like, and then I start clicking around on like other accounts he follows and stuff. And I'm seeing, just like I think among a lot of young American Christians that have felt like very dissatisfied with their modern society and so on, or pushing back, sometimes going too extreme, that I've encountered among some young Jews a similar thing of embracing Kahana or other figures like this, where these extremists on the Jewish side, and acting like this is a good thing, which, I mean, growing up, you never would have heard something like that.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, so one of the things I've had a lot of trouble with when I'm trying to evaluate this conflict, right? You mentioned earlier, for example, the issue of a genocide in Gaza, is that I hear just opposite things from different people, and it's very hard for me to sort through that information. Like, I'll have some friends who are very pro-Israel, and they'll send me stuff, and they'll say, no, the Palestinians are lying about everything. We're a very moral army. And then I have other people who will send me videos of like people starving there, right? But it's sometimes hard to figure out and sort through all the information, especially ever since my pro-Israel friends, they'll say, well, yes, bad stuff is happening, but it's Hamas. So there's the recent stories, for example, with the food being handed out. And I'm hearing from one side, that when people are coming to get food, Israeli soldiers are shooting them. And then I'm hearing from the other side that no, actually, Hamas has been stealing all the aid. And so Israel had to come in and set up these centers. And then either violence breaks out at some of these centers and some gunshots go off, or that Hamas is even the one shooting people at these centers to try to make Israel look bad. And so how do you sort through information like this to try to figure out what's actually happening?
I obviously, like, what I do, not everyone can do, because I look deep into the details and I go to like Arab deep Telegram channels. I talk to people on the ground, etc. But what I can tell you, Giron, is that you don't have to look at the pictures, and you don't have to look at all the details to conclude that it's genocide or not. You have to only look at the statements of the Israeli military and the Israeli prime minister before they realize that the world is turning around. Mm-hmm. They were stating very clearly, where there are no civilians in Gaza, there are no innocents. They were stating very clearly there will be no water, no electricity, no food in Gaza. All these things in itself is enough. Then you have to look to the way the killing was being conducted in Gaza. You have to look at the usage of AI and how they generated targets without even looking at who they are targeting. You have to look at the fact that they were willing to kill one Hamas, low-rank police member, which is like he's like nothing, like a soldier, and with up to 100 child with him. I'm not sure if 100 child, but 100 civilian, up to 100 civilian, would include a lot of children. So you have to look at the numbers. 17,000 of kids were killed in Gaza, children, women, etc. So I don't think it takes a lot to conclude that. Is Hamas terrible? Absolutely. Is Hamas causing trouble in Gaza? Absolutely. The question is not that, because we all know that Hamas is bad. They're a designated terrorist organization. But the problem is Israel is an ally of the US, consider itself a democracy, claims it's a democracy, and yet they're carrying out all these crimes.
Yeah. Maybe what I'm hearing in response, I'm trying to play devil's advocate here, is that like I have a friend who serves in the IDF, and what he'll say is he's like, and he served during this war, and he said, well, I was never like I was always very careful when we were carrying out strikes. There was many strikes that we didn't take because it would have killed too many civilians. And he says, there's really terrible government ministers saying stuff like that, and we need to force out Netanyahu. But this is because like if you look at the polling, right, in Israel, it's very anti-Netanyahu, but very pro this war. And so it seems a lot of people think that we should absolutely push out these ministers from the government, but this is a war for our survival because Hamas wants our destruction.
I think, again, that the conduct of the military is very clear. All what you have to do is read Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper, or read Plus 972. Both are Israeli newspapers that are critical of the war, and they tell you with their own words what is going on in Gaza is horrific. There are killing without any reasons. An Israeli soldier the other day told Haaretz that I felt like a Nazi. I felt that I was the Nazi. And this is a very powerful thing to say as an Israeli soldier who went through your entire life learning that the Nazis are the most evil people in the world. So to say that I felt like a Nazi, it's, I think, an indictment and a very strong statement coming from an Israeli soldier.
Yeah. So one of these stories that I felt like I have a very hard time sorting through is this situation in Taipei that you were talking about, because I've seen just very, very different narratives. And this is a story I've been following closely for a little while. And I want to push back a little bit on some of the narrative that I've been hearing actually from your side on it, not because... So I want to share some tweets I made just for the audience to show that I do really care about this. Let me share my screen here. Window. Here we go. So I've been following this story for the last month or so of what's going on in Taipei, right? And I saw Ihab, who I think is one of your employees at the Agora Initiative, shared this tweet of stuff being burned down in Taipei here by settlers. And so I put out a tweet to pray for persecuted Christians across the Middle East. And actually, this is where I start feeling like I got very invested in this story. Is the night before this, I was having some conversations in DMs with a Jewish guy who had reached out to me to ask me basically about, like, how could you be Catholic when there's this long history of Catholic anti-Semitism? And so I he commented here, and he was very dismissive of what was going on here, and he said, "Oh, this isn't a pogrom. This is just like a little bit of fighting." And I was like, "How can you like complain to me about the history of Catholic anti-Semitism, but now when Jews are doing something bad to Christians, you're going to be very dismissive of it?" And I got very annoyed at him for that. And then, all right, then as well, like a week later or so, this is on July 11th here, I was debating with a friend of mine on Facebook about this as well, because what he was telling me basically is, look, there's another narrative that the Jews are going to have. This is probably false information we're being given right now. And my reply to him, basically, because he was a fellow Jewish Catholic, and so he was dealing, I said, no, we as Catholics, whatever we feel about the conflict more generally, we have to stand in solidarity with Catholics. By this time, there had already been a letter put out by the local priests. And so I felt very strongly about this. And actually, in both these cases, the last one and in this one, I had like well-known scholars that I am friends with for theology who contacted me about this situation. They're like, is what we're seeing here real? And I was saying that I felt like EHUB is a very reliable source and so on, because you guys have called out Hamas as well. And I really appreciated your consistency in this story. And then as well here, I recently called out Luke Moon, who runs the Philos Project, about this, because he did a podcast about this situation in Taipei, where he this was becoming like now like in the international press and stuff at this point. Yeah. And I was getting really annoyed at Philos that they were calling out oppression of Christians in all the surrounding countries, but were ignoring this consistently, like any issue Israel did. And then especially the fact that now it was becoming this big story. Like I heard at this point, like a church was being burned and so on. And they're just completely ignoring this story. So finally, Luke comes out, and he's the director of the Philos Project, for those who don't know. And he does a podcast on it. And he really both sides the whole podcast. So I just re-listened to it this morning before I came on to make sure I fairly represented him in this tweet. And it really did come off like he was both sidesing things. He said, look, the Palestinians, they have their story. The settlers, they have their story, and probably will never know what's happened. And I thought, could you imagine if like an Islamist group was talking about, like, you know, the Christians, they were causing lots of issues, and that's why we had to like start fighting them, and some violence broke out. Like, he would never accept that sort of story from a Muslim group. He would be doing podcasts immediately on this. And so I felt like it was very unfair. And so after the initial burning, there was then this story that came out here that I felt like was very important. This came out on July 8th about something that had happened on July 7th. And EHUB here says, Israeli settlers set fire to the St. George Monastery and the Christian cemetery in the Christian village of Taipei, West Bank, one of the oldest Christian sites in Palestine. And it looks like from this photo, like when I saw this and what I thought was going on is it first says a monastery here. So I'm thinking there are like monks living right here. No. And then I see a bunch of smoke here that's happening right in front of this church. I see like a church that's like fallen down. And so I imagine there's like a larger wood structure built on this that's just been burned down. Like that's what I imagine when I see this tweet. And first of all, I don't know if there's a confusion with the St. George Monastery, because I looked up the St. George Monastery online, and there is a monastery called St. George on the West Bank, but it's a 50-minute drive away, according to Google Maps, from Taipei. There is this St. George Church, but these ruins are already here. Like it already looked like this before. And the fire there's very clearly a fire going on in the fields, but it's just in the fields here. Yeah. So I wanted to check, right, maybe did EHUB slightly misreport things? So I looked at the priest report as well, because there was a letter put out by the Latin priest, the Melkite priest, and the Orthodox priest about this story. And they don't make as bold of a claim as it felt like EHUB made here. Because they said on July 7th, 2025, settlers deliberately set fire near the town's cemetery and the historic church of St. George, dating back to the 5th century, one of the oldest religious landmarks in Palestine. Were it not for the vigilance of local residents and the swift intervention of firefighting teams, the damage could have been far more catastrophic. So what I'm imagining here still from this tweet, it doesn't sound like the church has been burned down, but I still imagine like a church that's being used like regularly is there.
Sure, yeah.
And then there's a fire here. So anyways, after all of this happens then, And actually, I think it was the day after I had sent that tweet calling out Luke Moon very publicly about this. I see a video of, I think her name is Eliana Passenstein, if I remember correctly. I'm trying to remember her name. She's a settler there on the West Bank, I'm pretty sure. And she goes and she visits the church. And she walks around it basically and says, look, there's no fire damage. This is already ruins of a church here. And she sort of looks at the camera and she says, there is a story here that someone set a fire. And there's a story that settlers were coming in to try to burn down a church. And someone wants you to believe that. And so at this point, when I saw that, I thought, all right, somebody here is seriously like lying to me or misrepresenting things, because I'm getting the opposite story. My first thought was like, did I unfairly call out Luke Moon for this? Have I been feeding this? Like when I sent that initial tweet out, I had a professor who reached out to me, as I mentioned, and asked me, is this really going on? And I said, yeah, this is absolutely the settler. Terrorism is a huge issue there. And I noticed the way he changed his own tune on how he was retweeting. He sort of hadn't tweeted anything about the war, and after that, he began retweeting like stuff calling for a ceasefire and so on. Like this seems like, to me, it was a very big story, and I got very committed because I care deeply about caring about fellow Christians here in the West Bank. Sure. Because after that video comes out, and as well, the Israeli police come out and they put out, there's this historic ruins here and a burned field, which is not the church. And so I see this as well in the Israeli police come out. So anyways, I saw, though, I think her name was Bree Dale, who was sharing around that video of the settler woman, and was sort of getting into a fight with Ehab about this on Twitter. And is this true or not? And Ehab, I think, rightly pointed out that the settler story is coming from a guy who's not at all reliable, who's been considered a terrorist even by the US government. Not the woman who was in the video, but the guy who was tweeting out the story. Because the story the settlers were putting out, which was completely unbelievable to me initially, was that actually the Christians set the fire and the Jews came over to put out the fire. And that was sort of the story I heard. But as I understand completely why Ehab thinks this is a ridiculous story. Why would you share this around and so on? But as someone who was just trying to understand what was going on, I felt like Ehab's response didn't actually address the points that were being brought up. Like the closest to the points he got addressed here are that there seems to be a little bit of burning, but this is like around the very outside of the thing. It doesn't seem like someone would set a fire to burn down like a stone church. And then he mentioned as well the livestock roaming in here, which to me, like that absolutely is like desecrating it to let livestock wander around here. But it's a very different story than someone trying to burn down a church. And then I also don't know from this photo who put that cow there for that photo. Right? I would really love to trust what the priests are saying in this story. But given that it felt like to me this was being misrepresented, I have a concern now that, all right, are there people unfairly representing what's going on here? As crazy as it sounds. And the last thing I want to bring up that I just saw last night, which changed things, is there was a, here, share this other video as well here. So there's this YouTube channel, I didn't know its existence until yesterday, called, I think the Israel Guys or something like that. And very clearly a pro-Israel channel. They're not going to tell you only one side of it, but they went to the actual site to try to investigate what happened. And they showed some other video that to me seemed to fit a little bit more with what the settler narrative was saying. So I just want to play this part of the video as well, just to get the context of what's going on here.
Pretty much where we're standing right now. You can see that the fire came close to the ancient ruins of the church, but it didn't reach it. And that's what we were able to walk around and show you on camera as well. The outside of the cemetery, the inside of the cemetery. I want to show you now a video of local residents throwing rocks. From where? Where do you think this is?
Well, it happens to be the cemetery we're sitting in that was supposedly burnt down, I guess.
Yeah, because you can see the slots where we were walking back there.
If you were to rephrase this, they would think these were the settlers, but these are not the settlers. These are Arabs.
Yeah, oh, very clearly, yeah.
Local Arabs that are
throwing rocks inside the cemetery, throwing rocks that way. Which also matches the video of the Jewish residents putting out the fire, because they would have been out there. So
this is happening simultaneously.
You could almost say, I mean, again, I'm determined to let you guys form your own conclusions. It appears like maybe the local Arab residents are throwing rocks at the Jewish fire brigade. One of the three fathers that wrote the letter, one of the three churches here. There's a video of a very nice guy, apparently, yelling at somebody. We don't know who it is. And he's speaking in Hebrew. The guy behind the camera is speaking in Hebrew. Right. And then if we look at the same video from a different angle, what does he do? He picks up a rock and chucks it.
And I have.
So yeah, that's sort of what I wanted. I get the priest yelling at the guy. That makes 100% sense to me. Like, obviously, settlers are coming over. You're going to want to yell at them. But it was then the throwing rocks at them as well. And especially because I don't know if it was the same priest or a different priest in the Vatican News report I had read a while ago was saying that, like, oh, we would never use violence against the settlers to push them off. But then I see a photo of him throwing a rock. And so I don't put all this up because I want to like just credit the story, but I want to try to figure out what the truth is. And I'm having a lot of trouble figuring out what's going on.
I can tell you what happened very clearly and concisely and simply. As you said, week before this happened, there was an attack on Kfar Malik, and on the outskirts of Taiba, the car that you saw burned, and two people were killed, literally, in Kfar Malik by settlers' terrorism, backed by the Israeli military. They literally get in Kfar Malik. And if you look at the map, Kfar Malik is literally right next to Taiba, and then something small happened to Taiba, and that's what Ihab reported in the first time. On the second time, when he reported on the burning of the church, what have happened is the settlers have gotten in, and they burned the fields around the church, and the fire almost reached there. We're not sure if it burned the church or not. Not the great damage have happened there, but this have already happened. The other thing that they're doing, as you could notice, there is an illegal settlement that was built on the land of around Taiba, and they used their cows, etc. And this is a strategy everyone knows. To expand the settlement, they would go, and wherever the cause would reach, whatever, they would would put something, they would try to take it, will start attacking the residents, etc. So I think it's natural that you'd see the Christians of the village will come to throw stones. I mean, I don't understand. If this happened in American property, they'll be shooting. I mean, they wouldn't be alive. They'll be killed. So to see a priest throwing a rock or another person, I mean, of course they're gonna do that. Like, are you kidding me? They're coming to burn stuff. And it didn't just happen out of context, Gideon. The burning happened and the settlers are coming there a week after two people were killed. It's not like just, hey, we're just showing up to do tourism or whatever. So, I mean, of course this would happen. Now, from my point of view, again, I would investigate and look into the details. But I think, to me, from day one, the details were clear because there is a pattern. If there was no pattern, if that was the first settler attack ever against anyone, then I would be like, oh yeah, let's investigate it. But they're attacking people every day. The only reason why the Israelis are denying it, because it became a big story. Have it not become a big story, you wouldn't see the five guys going to do any video. It became a big story, and thus they have to come with a counter narrative. But the narrative itself that settler violence exists, they know it and they acknowledge it and they support it. A lot of them, a lot of these people do support settlers violence. They're settlers themselves, like this lady who showed up in this other video. Beside this violence, I mean, you have to look all these villages. When you hear about the story of Sinjal, where a Palestinian Muslim was killed, Palestinian American Muslim. Many reported that he's Christian. He's actually not Christian. He's a Muslim. But the embassy condemned it. Hypocrite. Even the ambassador Mike Huckabee, who's the most pro-Israel ambassador you could get, called it act of terrorism, the killing of the American citizen. You know how far this is from Taiba? This is like 15 minutes drive. And this happened before the attack on Taiba. So all that is the context, Giron. If you see people coming, they light fire even close to the church. I'm not going to wait until the church is damaged to defend the church. I think I would come and try to defend it.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess where I'm coming from a bit and trying to understand all of this is that it seems the reports were initially like the church being burned down. Was that just misreporting, or do you think that...
I think it's a misreporting.
Okay.
That the entire church is being set down. I mean, it's an ancient church. It doesn't mean that it's not in usage, by the way. They use it. They do come to do divine liturgy sometimes, etc. As the case with many ancient other churches, because these are holy sites too. It's actually, for Christians there, it's even more important than your average church, because it is historical. It belongs to the people. It connects to the people, etc. And that's why the Patriarch of Jerusalem and the Cardinal Pio Battista had to come and do divine liturgy there and pray, because to them, in their mind, this is an important chairs that are historical and that is connected. Have it not been there, have it not been in the town of Taiba, I think they wouldn't have visited even.
Yeah. So I guess, how do you sort through then all this results information comes to you putting it in line with like the pattern is the case? Because I was just trying, I never know, like, right, is this particular, it could be something, right, is true
Not
of a
only
pattern,
the
but it's
pattern.
true in a case. Yeah, go ahead.
Not only the pattern, we have an actual videos and pictures. I think if you look at through Ihab's page, you still find it, of settlers setting the fire on. It's not like we don't have we have the pictures, and you cannot mistake settler for an Arab, not because of features or that we look different, but because of the hair and the style of the hair that they make it and the kippah, etc. So we have pictures of people, they look like Jews, settlers, they're setting things on fire. So it's not a mystery.
What I saw in the videos, there was the leaf blowers, right? So were they trying, you think, to increase the fires, basically? Or?
Of course. I mean, what do you think they're doing with it? I mean, it's very clear what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
I think only someone who comes with trying, like, are you doing inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning here? You know what I mean? Like, if you're coming wanting to prove that they didn't do it, you're gonna try to come up with a theory. You know, the settlers have a theory today about Goldenstein, the story we talked about, how he entered the Abrahamic mosque and called these people, that they call him innocent. They said he was walking by the mosque, they attacked him, so he shot at them. All the settlers in the West Bank believe that story about Goldenstein. And in the entire universe believe a different story, and the settlers believe a story. And it is very dangerous that today we have the Israeli police adopting the settlers' narrative. This wouldn't have happened if Ben-Gvir wasn't in the government, If Ben-Gvir is not the minister of police and security in Israel, I don't think the Israeli police would be ridiculous enough to publish such a lie.
Yeah, because when I put out that initial one of my Israeli Catholic friends commented, like, we don't hear these sorts of stories in Israel at all.
That's sad. Yeah, that's the sad part. It's not reported except in Haaretz.
Yeah, but I think
and no one reads Haaretz.
Yeah, I think the narrative a lot of them have is that there's a bunch of empty land on the West Bank, and so settlers are going to places where nobody's living, and they're just setting up communities there.
Yeah, exactly, which is the opposite of the truth. They put it in close to villages, so they make the villages' lives harder to ethnic cleanse them. And they say it. It's there. I mean, if you watch the videos, they say it.
Something I've noticed as well with, and thank you so much for helping to clear some stuff up with the Taipei story there.
Of course.
What I've seen with you as well is I saw interviews of you before October 7th and so on, before this current war, where you were very much in sort of the mindset of we have to have dialogue to solve the issue. And I think now you've shifted much more to being very skeptical of just dialogue as a way to solve the problem. Or you have a podcast called the Not a Dialogue podcast. You think there's a structural imbalance that has to be solved first. And I'm curious, you could go through maybe how this shift happened in your mindset.
The shift happened after years and years of attempts of what's so-called dialogue. You realize that at the end of the day, it's not working, that there's a structural issue where one side is more powerful, one side is pushing and has the power, ethnic cleansing, imposing the apartheid, and the other side does not have all this power. And that's why I think this new podcast that I'm doing with Silas Marcus, who is Jewish Zionist herself, yet critical of the occupation, critical of what the Israelis are doing in the West Bank, where we're saying dialogue is not really the solution. We need to talk. Here in the US, we need to have a dialogue. But a dialogue between me and a Palestinian who's under the occupation and the occupier, I don't think there is a dialogue. What a dialogue can the priest have had with the settlers who are coming to burn the church or burn the fields? I don't think that there is any form of dialogue you could have with them. There is not even common understanding on language. One thinks that God gave him the land. Everything belongs to him and you shouldn't be here. And you are here saying that this is my land and you cannot cross this land. So I think the concept of dialogue itself is a flaw. Now, between us Christians who, Jewish Christians and Palestinian Christians, no, this should be a dialogue. That's a different story. We're the body of Christ. We have to talk to each other. And even between Jews and Palestinians living in the US, I think a dialogue is important. But between Israelis and Palestinians, I don't think a dialogue is important. What we need is a solution. A peaceful solution to the conflict is what is needed. And that doesn't come through cycles of dialogue. This is like a liberal fantasy that they've been pushing. If you just sit together in circle and talk things through, you would come out. with the solution. It doesn't work this way. We need to address the structural issues.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that there is a small minority of Christians, both within Palestine. I mean, it used to be a much larger number until many left.
Yeah.
And of like Christians in Israel. How can those two communities come together? Like when I was talking with the Israeli Catholics on the last episode, I asked them, do you guys have any interactions at all with the Palestinian Catholics outside of, like, they have connections with the Arabs who were Israeli citizens, but not on the West Bank and Gaza, because there's no connection there really directly. And one of the things they've often felt when they try to talk to Palestinian Christians, because I've asked them, like, why don't you guys reach out more? And they've said, we've tried over and over and over again over the years. And they feel that the Palestinian Christians there don't want, like, Jewish Christians in their churches. So, like, one story I can share with you is there was the whole tweet that came out recently of where Joel Berry put out that disgusting tweet about how the Palestinians are in Gaza, the Christians are all Hamas. But I sent that to a friend of mine who lives in Israel. He was tweeting about it, rather, sorry. And he was saying that obviously that's no justification for bombing them and so on, but a friend of his who's a fellow Catholic had met some of these Gazan Catholics at a ordination event, and they were telling this fellow Catholic, this Catholic was ethnically Jewish, that, oh, one day the streets will run with Jewish blood. And I understand
that's ridiculous. Yeah.
They often feel very frustrated in trying to reach out to Palestinian Catholics. I guess, how do you think we can build those relationships that are very, very damaged? Because I
know almost every single Catholic and Christian in Gaza. I don't know for one person who would say that.
Mm-hmm.
I am not aware. There's just no evidence. This is fiction. I mean, maybe there's one person and it happened randomly that this person met, but it's impossible. I mean, I know every single person of them. I mean, these are people who were killed. I mean, they were killed and they're saying we want peace. The guy who was injured, and he was literally saying love is stronger than words. So I don't believe that. I think that's the problem with Israelis. I think generally is that they take certain narrative that they believe and then they start making up stories so many times. It is sad. I mean, I could make up stories too about how horrible the Israelis are, or what I heard, etc. But you know, I have enough stories that happened to me not to make up. So I mean, this is ridiculous. How do they come together? I think majority of Palestinian Christians don't know that they exist even. The concept itself is foreign. I mean, I am one of the few who know that they exist. How they come together, it's very difficult because the structure, legally, they can't enter each other's spaces, etc. I think the Jewish Christians have to do better at saying we're Christians, to allow us to see them, that they're Christians, and this would bring common ground. We are not, it's not secretive that we're Christians. We make it very clear. We're at the churches, the crosses are there. We have the crosses. We speak clear Christian language. We have a different view on the conflict, the one that is focused on nonviolence because of our Christianity, etc. If they want us to reach out more, I think they have to take this one step more. Now, on the Palestinian Church, I am also critical of them. I think that if a brother, whether it's a convert from Islam or Judaism, come to the church, I think they should be welcomed without any question. And by the way, one of the most influential priests in the West Bank up until lately was David Human, who you know who he is. He's Jewish, Catholic, convert. He was the most respected priest in Bethlehem. Teaches everywhere. Everyone knows he's Jewish, but no one had any issues with it. So the theory that, oh, we want to like Jewish blood or whatever, this is actually more like, it's actually insulting to many Christians. That, I mean, the numbers shows otherwise. We never heard of a Christian committing any act of violence. I think it's the situation is clear.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And to be clear, I didn't want to share that story if I'm saying it's true or anything. I'm just trying to pass along what I've heard and try to bring about the dialogue.
I totally get it. Well, thank you. Get on.
Yeah, thanks. You do have to go. You want to end by talking very briefly about your group, the Agora Initiative, and where people can find you and so on?
Absolutely, yeah. So you can find me at theagorainitiative.org. You can subscribe to our newsletter, and you can follow our work. It's at the Agora at agora.net on on Twitter. You can find it on Facebook as well. Agora is a space and organization that seeks to educate the public about what's going on in Israel-Palestine with the vision of equality and peace for Israelis and Palestinians. We are done with people like Hamas who don't want to see peace between Palestinians and Israelis. We are done with the Israeli government that wants to see destruction and wants to see more and more forever. We are about peace. We want to see peace. We want to educate the public so that they can support efforts for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. But peace cannot be fulfilled without accurate information. Peace is based on the premise of justice. And I think that's what we are after at Agora.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Khalil, and sharing your story. And I highly recommend everyone to go see more interviews of you, because there's lots of other stories of your life and what you've experienced that I think we didn't even get to mention here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Garan, for having me. That was really fun.